These are Manuka trees. They are a New Zealand native tree. They're part of the tea tree family, which you might know of for tea tree oil, which is like a really good antibacterial oil. And they're famous around the world for their honey. If you've ever heard of Manuka honey, it's often used to treat coughs and sicknesses. It's great for healing wounds because it has antifungal and antibacterial properties. And today I want to try and use this to make a mead. Now Manuka honey, you can get a multifloral Manuka honey, which is rather cheap, but to get pure Manuka honey, you're looking at like a couple $100 for a kg. So I'm going to be going with multifloral honey by Arataki, and we're going to be using that for the base of our mead. But before we start there, we need to find a yeast that we can use to make this mead. Now rather than get a store-bought yeast for making mead, I thought, what better yeast than the wild yeast that's growing on the Manuka trees to resist the antifungal and antibacterial properties that carry through to the honey. So today I thought we'd gather some flowers. These trees are a bit tall, but we'll gather some flowers because they only flower this time of year. It's mid-Jan. We've got till end of Feb, and I think the earlier the better that we get these, and also maybe a little bit of bark, and we see what we can get from that. Similar to what we did with the Putakawa mead, we're going to make a bug with those and a little bit of the honey itself and leave that for a couple of days, and we'll see what happens. So I'm going to climb a tree now. So there are no flowers in that tree. They're growing the thinner ones, and I'm a little bit too hefty to climb some of these. So I'm going to go up the hill a bit more to where the canopy is lower, and maybe I'll find some low-hanging fruit. Flowers. I've been up here for about 20 minutes or so trying to climb this tree and use my backpack as a stand, because right at the top of that really narrow sprig there are some flowers. First ones I've been able to find at this height that's kind of obtainable. So I'm going to keep trying. Otherwise over there's one that's recently fallen and it's got some little cones which I think become flower buds. They're like little seed pods. So worst case scenario we use those, but I do want something with fresh pollen because that attracts more natural yeast. What I ended up with was a couple of sprigs from the tree and some of these seed cones that I think will have a lot of natural yeast inside of them. I also ended up with a little extra bit of Manuka in my hand, which won't be going into the bug. So once I collected these resources, I quickly sanitized a jar, added some fresh spring water and some Manuka honey to it. And you can see this Manuka honey is quite thick, so I will need to shake it up just a little bit. Once it had become homogeneous, I could then add some of the sprigs and the seed cones that I collected and top that up with some more spring water. I wanted to keep a bit of headroom for bubbling, and I gave that a nice big shake to get the yeast dislodged and get it all mixed into this bug. Once I'd done that, I did tear the sprigs in half just so I could submerge them properly under the water, and that way nothing was growing above the water because that's a sure recipe to get some mold growing. And then I left it on a heat pad, and you can see after 2 days it was already starting to get nice and bubbly, and there was a lot of activity happening in there, which I was quite surprised about. As I mentioned before, Manuka has antifungal properties, so it was great to see that there was some yeast living on there that I could exploit. Then me and my son headed down to the local water fountain to get some fresh spring water from deep below the Earth's crust, and I needed to find a bit of Manuka to make a stave out of. I had some firewood that was seasoned for about a year. You can see that there's a beetle that likes to cut in and its grub nests inside of the Manuka or Kanuka. So this particular piece of firewood had been ravaged by one of these. I selected a piece that was nice and clean, had a good colour in the heartwood, and it was time to split that in half. And you can see the grain of this wood. It's wavy and the long grain looks really interesting and unique. So this is going to be a great stave. I just needed to whittle it down so it would actually fit inside of my vessel. And now that it's been toasted and it's almost ready, I just want to make a few cuts into it so it's like the spiral of oak that I got from the brew shop. And that will just increase the amount of surface area that comes into contact with the Manuka wood and therefore increase the flavour that it imparts into the brew. My bug is sitting on my heating pad along with all of the honey that I'm going to put into the actual mix. The reason I put it here is just to encourage it to be nice and runny when it's time to finally add it into the carboy. And now the day of making the must has come. So I'm going to rip the lid off all of these packets of honey and go through a very trialing period of adding it into the must. As you can see, it's going to be a lot easier to do if you have a big bucket. Once I empty that bucket out behind it, that'll probably be what I mix my musts in and then add them to the carboy after the fact. I had to go through a painful process of watering down the honey and adding it in, and it ended up getting everywhere and my hands got all sticky and
it gets everywhere.
First world problems, right? Once I was able to get all of the honey into the carboy, I added a little bit more water and gave it a very vigorous shake just to oxygenate all of that water and to get the honey all nice and mixed up. Then I topped it up and then I added the bug. So I just tipped the whole thing and I didn't have any plans to keep this. I was careful to try and stop some of the seed pods from falling in, but if a few got in there, it wasn't really going to be a big deal since I'll be racking this off later on. Then I topped it up with a little bit more water and gave it another vigorous shake. I took a gravity reading and it came out at 1.100. And then I finally added the stave, which is probably a little bit too big. And once that was done, I chucked the airlock in, and once that was on, it was ready to go into the heating pad and ferment for a little bit. And after 11 days, I decided it was time to take a sample to see how things had been tracking. In the time in between, I didn't get any footage of this, but it actually was so active that it bubbled up through the airlock, which is a great sign that the yeast that was alive in the wood was super powered. So 11 days later and the ABV was coming up at 1.06, so that was roughly around 6.5%. So again, we're playing with a wild yeast, we don't know what its overall alcohol tolerance will be, so this is actually a bit of a win for me because I wasn't expecting it to go anywhere over 5 just to set my expectations. So we'll rack it off here and we'll let it keep going for a little bit longer as there is room for it to continue fermenting with the amount of sugars that's in there. And you can see that there's a nice amount of sediment that's left over. We'll dump that for clarity's sake and we'll continue fermenting in the new bottle. So this is over a month later, 6th of March, and we'd noticed that the activity had almost completely stopped in the carboy, so it was time to start bottling these. I had a little helper with me who was very excited to see how this whole process would work and even more excited to help out. Do you want to chuck these in?
Oh, yeah. Can I just drop them?
Just drop them all in.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if you can reach up there. Can you reach all the way up there? Oh, keep going. Okay. Just one pump. Go down. Look at that, that's brilliant. Pop that in. This gives us a reading of how much alcohol is in here. The final reading of the mead at this stage was 1.030, which was about 10%, give or take, and there was still a bit of room for it to continue fermenting.
We need to put more in. We need to make more.
We need to make more mead. Well, that's what that's all mead as well.
Oh, I want it.
You want to try some? I don't know if you'll like it. Have a smell.
It smells like honey.
Have a tiny sip. But my assumption is that the yeast had completely died, and if it hadn't, there was enough sugar in there to make it a little bit sparkly as we go through this process. So I bottled it up and saved it a little bit longer before it was time to do the final taste test, which you're about to see now. So here we are, almost 2 months later. We bottled this with the young guy back at the beginning of April, and now we're towards the end of May. It's the first really wintry blast that we've had here today, so it's chilling down. I thought it'd be a perfect time to pop open this 500ml bottle and give our Manuka Mead a try. Not very much of a hiss. And almost completely still, which is a bit disappointing because I prefer it sparkling, but it doesn't change the flavour. So this was aged for a while. I'll put the time here because I haven't actually reviewed the footage and can't remember how long it sat in there for, but it sat with a Manuka stave in there for a while. Again, time there, and that will have introduced some of the tannins from the wood into the flavour of the alcohol, and then, you know, hopefully that doesn't take too much away from the sweet Manuka honey that we used, but hopefully it'll balance the flavour a little bit. Okay, damn, that is good. Even though it's still, that is a really bold flavour. Really nice. I've had a Manuka mead before that you can buy from the supermarket here, and it's $20 for a bottle, and you get 700 mils or whatever, and it's been aged for 20 years, and it has it's like a really nice dessert wine. This is different, and I like it. I can't quite put my finger on it. I have to say, I haven't been making mead very long. I looked at one of my oldest bottles, and it's 6 months old at the moment, so I'm still quite new to all of this. And one day I'll nail the way of making it sparkling. I've got a couple of meads obviously going behind me. One of them has the same Manuka stave in it. It's just a regular mead, just made with wild honey. And I'm hoping to use that stave a few more times. And as I get further into my brewing journey, I want to do some rums and stuff like that that have been aged with Manuka wood as well. But this time around, what I did was I charred the stave. So I'd love to come back and do another one of these next year, maybe start in early spring when the wild yeasts are a bit stronger, and use that same stave again. One thing in all my research that I see talked about a lot is what is the right type of yeast to use in a mead. And again, just a layman with this, I'm still learning, but there's a lot of arguments of what yeast to use to get a good mead. And I think this begs the question that maybe the right yeast comes from the flower or the tree where the pollen for the honey comes from. Maybe that's the right yeast to put into a mead. Maybe wild yeasts are something to be explored further in this community. Who knows? Let me know your comments down below what you think. And I'm going to sit here and drink this and enjoy it and think about life. So thank you very much for watching this one. If you haven't seen it, I've done a Putukawa mead that I made with wild yeast as well. And if you're wondering what's there, again, ask me the questions. I'd love to answer them. Maybe I'll make some more videos about these random flavors in the future, which would be hard because I haven't filmed any footage for it. Have to start from scratch. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Great mead.
I love everything. Fire spreading all around my room. My world's so bright, it's hard to breathe, but that's alright.